Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, President Ben Radcliffe and Dorothy, Pastor Schuler, members of the Board of Directors, State Senate Majority Leader Harvey Woolman, and other members of the legislature who are here, Dale Gullickson and other state officials, and members and guests of the South Dakota Farmers Union. I want first of all to thank Ben Radcliffe, who has led this organization so well in recent years, and to thank each one of you for the privilege of being here as your final speaker tonight. I've shared this stage on a number of occasions with strong voices in the field of agriculture, with Emil Lorix, who is here this evening, and M.W. Thatcher, Jim Patton, Tony DeShant, Hubert Humphrey, who always complains that this speaker's box here pins him in too much and doesn't give him enough maneuverability, and so many other people who have spoken from this stage. I want to thank Al Bussian for that sentiment about how we ought to fill the vacancy in the vice presidency, but the thought that that suggestion might be carried out probably has to go under the heading of things least likely to happen in 1973. I did take the time last night to look up the time on the vice president's speech. He spoke at 6:30 to the entire nation last night, and I'm wondering how many of you checked the television listings to see what the programs were that were preempted by the vice president's speech. There were 3 network programs that were slated to appear at that same time that the vice president preempted, and this is true. Those 3 programs were the following: Truth or Consequences, To Tell the Truth, and Let's Make a Deal. I know you think I manufactured that, but if you'll check the television log, you'll see that those 3 programs were actually scheduled to appear all at once last night at 6:30. And it occurred to me that out of one of those 3 program titles, the vice president should have been able to find a pretty good text for the sermon that he delivered. And of course, I feel very humble about this difficulty over the vice presidency. I had some trouble myself in the selection of a vice presidential running mate, and you may recall that I was rather severely criticized for not using more effectively the 24 hours I had after winning the nomination to carefully check out my vice presidential selection. But apparently even 4.5 years isn't enough time to make a check into all the possible things in a person's past. But we don't really come here tonight to talk about that, but to talk about the central interest of the Farmers Union, which is the quality and condition of life in agricultural America, and how we're meeting our responsibilities to each other, to our own society, and to human beings in other parts of the planet who depend on us for assistance. As I reflect over the nearly 17 years that I've been able to serve in Washington, some 4 years in the House of Representatives, 2 years with President Kennedy and the Food for Peace program, and now nearly 11 years in the United States Senate, I can't think of a single year that has been quite so momentous in the life of agriculture as 1973. Average prices for farm products have surpassed 100% of parity for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century. Corn stands at 114% of parity, wheat at 127%, and net farm income for this year is projected at around $24 billion. Our exports will set another new record, probably in excess of $15 billion before the end of this calendar year, and we're harvesting an all-time record crop, nearly 6 billion bushels of corn, 2 billion bushels of wheat, and 1.5 bushels of soybeans. A harvest price of about $2.50 per bushel for corn and $4.75 per bushel for wheat, I think you'd agree is almost unprecedented. And there are no surpluses overhanging the market, which was at least the problem we talked the most about when I first entered public life in the early 1950s. Secretary of Agriculture Butts, as early as May of this year, was referring to prosperity for agriculture in these terms, and I quote, "The promised land of sustained growth, profitable production, and income commensurate with that realized by non-farm sectors of the economy." But I'm wondering tonight if the picture is really that rosy. Have we really reached what we could describe in any meaningful sense of the word as the promised land? Let's look at some of the other developments of the past year that we need to consider, along with those things that have brought some measure of hope to American agriculture. First of all, the miracle of farm production for the first time since World War II fell short of our domestic and foreign needs. Secondly, our fuel production, our energy production, for the first time failed to make enough fuel available to meet even some of the most urgent needs of the nation. There is not enough propane for crop drying, and many fuel dealers have been unable to meet their commitments even for harvest operations. Fertilizer is in critically short supply at this very moment. Many farmers already cannot obtain adequate fertilizer for this fall's field preparation, and we're about 1 million tons short of anhydrous ammonia alone projected for 1974. One of the reasons for this, as you know, is that the price controls invoked on fertilizers here at home have led to a massive export of American fertilizer, which is in short supply all over the world, into countries that were willing to outbid the market here in the United States. The prices of future contracts of many commodities have swung wildly up and down all through 1973. Boxcars have not been available to move our grain to market, and a number of federal rural assistance programs, as President Radcliffe has said, REA, rural water and waste disposal, conservation cost sharing, and many other programs have come close to losing their lives under the threat of impoundment or actual impoundment or vetoes these past few months. And the cost of everything that farm families buy continues to rise. Now, these problems also have to be viewed against the background of the Secretary's assurance that we're now in the promised land. For the first time, when this nation was not in a major war, we have had the imposition of price controls on food and farm products. For the first time in memory, limitations have been placed on agricultural exports, something that we used to push very hard as the very lifeline of our agricultural economy. And in the cities, for the first time in many years, housewives have held angry meetings to denounce farmers, to denounce farm prices, and at least by inference, to denounce farm families themselves for exploiting the urban consumer. So it's been an eventful year for American agriculture, but not a year of unmixed blessing when you consider these developments that have moved along in conjunction with those things that we applaud on the agricultural price front. Now, most of you have wondered, I'm sure, as I have, how the strongest nation in all the history of the world, with the most advanced technology, the most sophisticated economy, could blunder into chronic shortages of what someone has described as the 3 F's: food, fuel, and fertilizer. I remember some years ago, the New York Times did a little profile on me in which they said that the cornerstones on which George McGovern has built his public life are the 3 F's: food, farmers, and his fellow men. Well, now we see 3 shortages in this country: in our fuel supply, in the fertilizer that is one of our principal necessities in meeting the demands for increased production next year, and for food grains and other essential commodities. We had a hearing conducted jointly by Senator Humphrey and myself a few days ago, looking into the problem of world grain supplies. And near the end of that hearing, in which one witness after another described the shortages of grains, the shortages of fertilizer, the shortages of fuel, I asked a very distinguished authority in this field, Dr. Lester Brown, how it is that in a great government like ours we have permitted these shortages to come upon us. And he said, I think the answer to that, Senator, is the fact that there's a 4th F that's an even greater shortage in this country, and that's the shortage of foresight and leadership. We've known for years that per capita food consumption in the United States and the rest of the developed world has been growing faster than the capacity of the world to meet that need. We know that the American consumer has become accustomed to a better diet, 110 pounds of beef each year for each person, 65 pounds of pork, 565 pounds of milk and dairy products each year. And we know, too, that the incomes of other industrial countries are constantly rising, so that Japan and Western Europe and Canada and Australia and countries representing the most affluent nations on this earth are following in our footsteps in their demands for more meat and more products that consume large quantities of grain. But we did not plan for that bulge on the demand side. We continued to plan as if we were destined to live with agricultural abundance and surpluses for an indefinite future. Now, it took no great prophet to warn that a nation with 6% of the people on this earth that was consuming 34% of the world's energy and fuel, to see that someday we were going to be in trouble if we didn't look very carefully to the sources of supply. And this crisis that's now raging in the Middle East, that I personally think is the most serious single outbreak we've had in the Middle East in all the years since the State of Israel has existed, has underscored again the uncertain nature of this petroleum and fuel that comprises such an important part of our economy. A real, genuine fuel shortage in this country over any period of time means a recession. There's no other way to look at it. A country that depends so heavily on mechanized equipment, on fuel from the earth, to function cannot survive in a prosperous economy without an assured source of fuel. And yet we continue to build 2-ton automobiles, and I admit that I drive one, and I see them by the hundreds of thousands lined up bumper to bumper every day when I drive to work. We continue to waste our fuel resources. We continue to burn far more in the way of electric energy than is essential to our needs, and we do not require the kind of effort that is needed at this time to develop alternative sources of fuel. Certainly it's been apparent for many years that developing nations would follow in our steps in multiplying the consumption of these precious sources of energy that make modern living possible. Still, in the face of rapidly rising demand for food, we did very little, if anything, as a nation to plan for the enormous new pressures that would be brought to bear on limited fertilizer supplies. And at this very moment, that is a critical need confronting this country and other food-producing nations if we're going to meet the target goals that have been set for us. I wonder how different it might have been if we had had the kind of foresight and leadership over the past 10 years that has been represented by some of the voices raised in this room. Men like Bob Lewis, who for as long as I can remember has been warning the Congress, warning everyone who would listen, that we were headed for precisely this kind of a crisis in this country if we did not begin to plan for the day when business as usual would not be enough to meet the demands for food of a growing world. Jim McHale, Bob Henshin, and others who have spoken out, warning us about the crisis that is now upon us. I'm wondering, too, how different things would be today if the policy recommendations of the Farmers Union had been listened to in the councils of government over the years. One of your key recommendations was that we ought to build up an adequate food reserve in on-the-farm storage in this country, and that we ought to establish strategic food reserves around the globe, and how much sense that makes. Senator Aiken, the senior Republican in the Senate, and I have joined together in such a proposal in this session of the Congress, but it should have been done years ago to prevent the kind of wild fluctuations in commodity markets and the kind of critical shortages that we now see developing in South Asia, in Africa, and in other parts of the globe. If we had adopted another kind of recommendation by the Farmers Union, the price policies that you have called for, assuring our food producers of a parity scale that would have moved up and down with changes in the cost of living, rather than waiting for a shortage to balloon prices dramatically in a year's time, we would not have had the kind of consumer anxiety and consumer revolts that we have experienced this year. We wouldn't have had these boycotts. We wouldn't have had the necessity or even the urge for a beef price freeze that has played such havoc with our livestock markets in recent months. If the forward-looking transportation policies recommended by the Farmers Union, both nationally and by this state organization, had been followed, we wouldn't have the lack of facilities to handle our grain at marketing time. Certainly, the time-honored Farmers Union position on price and income supports, had it been listened to, would have resulted much earlier in the kind of target price system, the so-called Brannon concept, that finally, after all these years, we've written into the 1973 Act. Now, I'm pleased with this year's Farm Bill as far as the concept of the bill is concerned. But it goes without saying that that bill is already out of date, considering the compromises we had to make with the House of Representatives and with the administration in order to get it passed. We had to, for example, concede on the target price level very substantially from the Senate bill, and make changes in the escalator clause, the cost of living escalator clause. We had to delay the effectiveness of that by a full 2 years. And so while the bill is sound in concept in providing a price floor under agricultural commodities that will prevent disaster on the farm, it does not set those target prices at a level that will guarantee farm producers a fair return on their labor and their investment. So I want to suggest here tonight 4 brief steps that I would like to see added to our agricultural policy to make it the kind of basic farm law that it ought to be. First of all, we must redirect our policy from one which grew out of a surplus mentality to one which deals with an age of scarcity. Now that means we must come to grips with America's role as a food provider in the face of spreading world hunger. We no longer have surpluses to give away, but we do have some obligation to hungry, desperately poor people, underdeveloped economies in those parts of the world where there are occasional, if not chronic, food shortages. Maintaining a capability to provide food for those in need is not only a humanitarian goal, but one which is important to every American farmer. And let me say in that connection, as one who has been interested in this field of world hunger and nutrition during all the years I've been in public life, that while I want to see the United States strong militarily, I want to see us spend a reasonable amount of our federal budget on those purposes, I really believe that in the last 25 years, the food and fiber that we have shipped overseas into food deficit areas of the world has done more to prevent those countries from slipping down the path of totalitarianism and communism than all the military hardware we've shipped all over the globe since the end of World War II. Secondly, we must do more to provide incentive to American farmers to produce the food and fiber that's going to be demanded by a growing population and rising world income the globe around. That means that the Secretary of Agriculture ought to use all of the authority that he has in this new farm bill to make certain that the farmer will earn a profit if he expands production along the line that's being recommended by the administration. Now, one significant action by the Secretary this year runs directly counter to that goal. And this is something that I know about from personal experience because I was in the committee every minute when we were drafting the formula of the target price concept for both wheat and feed grains. But when the Secretary of Agriculture, in calling for all-out feed grain production, establishes a national acreage allotment of 89 million acres for 1974 instead of the 131 million acres that we had in 1973, it is not likely that he is going to give the kind of assurance to farmers that will be necessary to encourage all-out production. Now, it may be, it probably will be, that the demand is such that prices on wheat and feed grains are not going to fall to the target level in any event. But we're setting a precedent. And what we intended in the committee is that that target price system should cover the entire allotment, the entire base acreage of all persons participating in the feed grain program. And what the Secretary has done, in effect, is to do an end run around the intent of the Congress. He tried very hard to get the committee to agree that the 70% of parity price guarantee that we wrote into the bill would cover only 1/2 of the base acreage. We said no. We'll settle for 70%, but only if it covers the entire allotment, the entire base acreage. And the Secretary has not kept faith with the Senate Agricultural Committee in reducing that allotment from something over 130 million acres to 89 million acres. And so I've demanded that hearings be held immediately on this question of the announced allotment to see if we can't restore it to what the committee had in mind. Now, thirdly, we must reform the system of commodity futures trading We have a situation in commodity exchanges today where speculators are able to drive that price up and down on an incredible scale. Soybeans ranging this year all the way from $3 to $12 in a few months' time, not to the enrichment of the producer or the consumer, but to the enrichment of those playing the commodity markets. And so this past week, I've introduced a new commodity exchange bill that would create in the commodity fields the same kind of an exchange regulation mechanism that the Securities Exchange Commission has provided for the last 40 years in the stock market. The trading of commodities in this country is now almost a $300 billion a year business. It's bigger than the trading of stocks on the stock exchanges of the country. And the time has come to establish an independent Commodity Exchange Commission with full enforcement power, with the capacity to enforce its own orders, to provide some degree of regulation on the ups and downs of commodity trading, and to level out these wild gyrations that have brought so much uncertainty and insecurity to our commodity exchanges. Finally, we should enact as soon as possible the Family Farm Act that Senator Aberesk and Senator Nelson of Wisconsin and I have sponsored for some time, that would prohibit farming by large non-farm corporations. It is simply not true that corporation farming is more efficient than family farming. It's less efficient, dollar for dollar. But they have the tax breaks, the tax loss considerations that enable them to compete unfairly for capital, machinery, and other production inputs. These 4 steps that I've just touched on here tonight, I submit, would help develop a system of production of food and fiber which would fairly reward the men and women who work the farms and ranches of this country, and their policies that would be fair to the consumers of this land. I think it does us very little good to have the most devastating weapons on the face of the earth if our economy is on a shaky footing, or our capacity to supply food and fuel and fertilizer and other essential ingredients is in disarray. It's all well and good for the President to say that he doesn't want America to be a second-rate power. Nobody wants us to be a second-rate power, but let us understand that there's more to the quality of a country than the size of its weapons stockpile. And it doesn't do any good for us to boast about having the biggest aircraft carriers and the biggest submarines and the biggest missiles if we don't have a just and strong and dependable economy that deals fairly with all of the people of this land. And we've got to be not only a first-rate power in the sense of our defenses, but a first-rate power in the moral and social and economic fibers that provide the strength of a great country. So with your help and your continued foresight, I think we can build the kind of a country that will bring pride and confidence to ourselves and to our children at a time when those qualities are under attack as never before. It's apparent to me now that the direction our country moves in the balance of this decade is not going to be decided by some miracle-working superhuman leader. It's going to be decided by each one of us. A nation can be no more truthful than each one of us, no more honest, no more democratic, no more worthy of respect and confidence than each one of us. And there's plenty for every one of us to do. So for each person in this auditorium. I would wish that you would earn an epitaph like the one found on a church near London, which reads as follows: "In the year 1653, when all things in the kingdom were either profaned or demolished, this church was built by Sir Richard Shirley, Baronet, whose singular praise it was to do the best things in the worst of times." I would like to think that that has always been and will continue to be the guiding purpose of the officers and members of the Farmers Union. Thank you very much for the privilege of sharing this program with you tonight.